Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second class on Bishul Akum, when a non-Jew is doing the cooking. And how do we allow it to be permissible? So here, the Gemara in Masechet Avodah Zarah 38a goes into a discussion about whether there is a Jew involved in the cooking process. And if there's a Jew involved in the cooking process, perhaps in those scenarios it's permitted. So here, let's have a look at the Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shmuel. So Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, Hiniach Yisrael basar agabe gechalin. If the Jew places the meat on the coals, Uba hagoy vehefech bo, and the non-Jew comes and turns the meat over. Mutar, that is permitted. Itamar nameh, and it's also stated. Amar Rabba bar bar Chana, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabba bar bar Chana says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Ben shehiniach goy vehefech Yisrael, whether it's the goy, the non-Jew, placing it down, and the Jew turning it over, ubein sheniach Yisrael v'afech goy, or it's the Jew who places it on the coals and it's the non-Jew turning it over. Mutar, it's permitted. Ve'eino asur ad sheteheh techilato ugmaro biad goy. It's only forbidden, or it's only considered food cooked by a non-Jew if the entire process from beginning to end is done by a non-Jew. So accordingly, Bishul Akum does not take effect unless a Gentile performed the entire cooking process. But if the Jew performed either the placement of the food or turning it over, the food is permitted. And that's the ruling of the Rambam here that we see in source 29. For Kosher Bishlo Yisrael Ma'at Bishulah, whenever a Jew performs a small part of the cooking, Bein b'tchila, bein basof, whether it's the beginning or at the end, mutar, permitted. Therefore, im hiniach hagoy basar or kedera gabe'esh, if the non-Jew places the meat or the pot upon the fire, v'hafach Yisrael babasar, and it's the Jew who turns it over, and it's the Jew who turns it over, and he's the one stirring the pot. Oh, sheniach Yisrael v'gamar hagoy. No, or it's the Jew who places it on the fire, and it's the non-Jew who completes the action. Harei ze mutar. Behold, this is permitted. So if we stop here at this point, what we see from the Gemara and Harambam is that if the Jew is involved somehow in the cooking process, in a main part, either he places the food on the fire, or he is stirring the pots, or he is turning the, or he's placing the food on the fire, off the fire, that kind of thing. What we don't see here in the notes is he's just literally turning on the fire. From the Rambam and the Gemara, it's more involved than that. He's placing the food onto the fire, or he's putting the food into the oven, or he's stirring the pot. It's not enough just to turn on the fire from what we see on the Rambam. So where do we get this custom, where do we get this halacha that if the Jew turns on the pilot light or turns on the gas, that it's okay? One of the most important practical questions concerning this today involves whether the Jew may simply turn on the fire used for the cooking. According to the Beit Yosef, which is Maran Yosef Cairo, although the Gemara and Rambam state clearly that the Jew need not perform the entire process, it's not sufficient for him to just ignite the oven or stoke the coals. Rather, he must participate in the actual cooking process. We see here in this lengthy source in number 30, he goes into it in a great deal of length, and he quotes the Rabbeinu Nissim, and he quotes the Rashba, and he quotes the Rivash, Rav Yosef Bechor Shor, Rav Yitzhak Bar Sheshet, sorry, and all of them say, all Sephardic Rishonim, they all say it's not enough just to light the fire or stoke the coals. The Jew must be more centrally involved in it by literally placing the food on the fire. Is a big difference than just turning on the fire. However, the Darkei Moshe, which is Rav Moshe Isserles, the Ramaz, much longer version, where he wrote a small commentary to the Torah. You can see that in the Darkei Moshe there. He writes, it seems to me, and we'll see this one in English, Nireli, that all these many commentaries hold that stoking is also forbidden, like lighting, and that which the Gemara said that if the non-Jew turned over or stirred the meat, it is permitted. It does not mean that he turned over the coals, which is stoking. Rather, it refers to the meat, as the Rambam writes that if he turned over the meat or stirred the pot, it is permitted. But from the words of Rav Yisrael Isserlin, known as the Maharai, author of the Tirumat Hadeshim, that I wrote earlier, who writes that the custom is to permit cooking done by the Gentile maidservants, since it's impossible that he, the Jew, will not stoke at least one. It is evident that one may certainly permit through stoking, and this is the ruling of the Aroch, Issa V'Heta Aroch, to permit through stoking and throwing in a chip of wood. And he quotes again here later on, Maharam Rottenberg, that he writes there in the name of Maharam, that if the non-Jew lit one fire from another fire of a Jew and she cooked with it, the cooked dish is permitted. And the same appears in the Mordechai, that stoking is effective and certainly making the fire is effective. So we have here a classic scenario where the Ramah is noting the minhag, the practice of Ashkenaz, and the practice which was going on in the Ashkenazic countries in, or at least in 16th century Poland, was they had these non-Jewish maids, and the non-Jewish maids were really involved in the food from beginning to end. And it says the only reason why they were they could permit it is they said, you know what, it's inconceivable that the Jew did not stoke the coals or light the fire. And that is the only way that they are involved in the cooking process. So it's almost like a Maaseh Shahaya. That was what was going on there. The Ramah knew the halacha. He knew what the Rishonim said. He saw that the Rishonim, especially the Sephardic Rishonim, were all strict in this matter and said, stoking the coals or lighting the fire is not enough. You've got to put the food directly onto the fire, or you've got to stir it when it's on the fire, or you've got to turn over the food. But not enough just to light the fire or turn on the oven. Nevertheless, he said, but look, that's what we see. That's what's going on where we are. And so the Ramah seems to permit it. And this is the halacha. In Shulchan Aruch, Maran Yosef Cairo rules that ein shigirat hatanur mo'elet ele b'pat. Lighting the fire of the oven does not help. It only helps with bread. About b'sh'ah ha'metzav shilim, but with other food, ein shigirat hatanur v'lo hadlakat ha'esh ma'ala u'moredet. Then guess what? If for other food, igniting the oven or lighting the fire doesn't help or hurt. Ela hahanacha davka, rather the placing of the food in the oven only. Therefore, harotze levashel b'machavat b'tanur shel goy, tzarich sheyiten Yisrael hamachavat letoch hatanur lemakom haroi leitbashel sham. Therefore, one who wishes to cook in a pan in an oven belonging to a non-Jew, the Jew must place the pan into the oven to the place where it can potentially get cooked there, i.e., it's totally the placing inside of the oven. The Rama says, "V'yesh cholkin," but there are those who disagree. Usvira lahu, and they hold the hadlakat ha'esh, that lighting the fire, or chitui bagechalim, or stoking the coals, mahaneh, that is effective. Le'inyan bishul, regarding cooking, kamo le'inyan part, just like it is for bread. V'chein nohagin, and that is our practice. That is our custom. And even stoking without intent, even if that's not that wasn't one's intention when one stoked the coals, even that's effective. And there are those who say, and there are those even more lenient and say, you know what, even if the non-Jew took a light from a fire set up by a Jew to light another fire, that is also permitted. So here we have it. It seems, looking at these positions, that the Rama is coming to, I wouldn't say whitewash, but he's coming to justify with a very difficult forced read to say, you know what? That's what we're seeing. That's what people are doing. And so therefore, it must be effective that lighting the fire or stoking the coals is enough. Whereas Maran, Yosef Cairo, is holding that the only way to not make it Bishul Akum is placing the food in the oven. And there are such restaurants that I know, not in Seattle, but I know that there are restaurants, kosher restaurants in LA and New York, where you can go to them and say, I'd like to place my steak or my fish or whatever you're having on the grill or on the fire or in the pan, or can I take the frying pan and put it on top of the fire? You can do that in some places. Again, I don't think it's done in Seattle, but I've seen it, and that's one way of getting around it.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Is that why at Einstein Brothers, that when there's certain things that you're having, you push the button on the microwave? Like if you're having certain things like an egg mitt sandwich, you know, where they put like a scrambled egg in there? Is that where this all comes from?
We're going to get to microwaves and see if microwaves is different, whether Bishul Akum applies in microwaves, but it's probably the same kind of thing, exactly. But microwaves are a little different.
And the other question is, why is there a difference between bread? What is it because it's a solid and not liquid? What's the difference?
Regarding bread, there seem to be three major steps in the process, and that the Rishonim saw that lighting the fire was the essence of the baking process, whereas cooking is different, and that that wasn't an essential stage to it. That's just the way that the Rishonim understand the scenario. They're saying baking, there's kneading the dough, there is turning on the fire, and there's placing it in the oven. Those are three steps. So as long as the Jew is involved in one of those three, it's enough. Whereas for cooking, there seems to be only two stages: putting it in the oven and mixing it or turning it off. So turning on the fire isn't, for them, they don't see it as an essential stage. So let's go back.
Question.
Sure, go for it.
It seems to me like if the idea is, with the whole Bishul Akum thing, is to prevent intermarriage, it seems to me like the more involved a Jew is in the cooking with non-Jews, then the more conducive that is towards building a relationship that would lead to intermarriage, rather than if they're totally hands-off.
So that's an excellent question here. And we're going to see, I read out the question, Stephen. We're going to see that as we get into these sources where they're saying that perhaps the concern of intermarriage is not there when we're talking about maids or servants or waiters and waitresses, that there isn't hired help that isn't likely that's going to lead to intermarriage. And again, maybe talking about the class system, that let's imagine for ourselves an upper class Jewish family with maids and servants and the like. It's unlikely that that's going to lead to intermarriage. And perhaps that's another reason why they weren't concerned about it. And perhaps we'll see as we go through here, I think the Shach mentions that it is a room to be lenient in that scenario because the chance of intermarriage is low. But we'll see. It's an interesting point, Stephen, and we'll see that in the sources.
Okay, thanks.
Let's continue here. So according to Shulchan Aruch, the Jew must participate in the actual act of cooking, such as placing the food in the oven or on the fire or stirring the pot. By contrast, the Ramah allows the Jew to turn on the fire and also cites the opinion that the Gentile lighting a fire from a pre-existing fire lighted by a Jew is sufficient. The more stringent opinion of Shulchan Aruch is accepted as standard, generally followed by Sephardim, while the more lenient opinion of the Ramah is accepted as a standard followed by Ashkenazim. Rav Ovadia Yosef writes a very interesting case here in source 34, that if the non-Jew placed the pot on the stove, but the fire had not been turned on, then the Jew turning on the fire would be actually very helpful here. So he says here, Mikol Makom, nevertheless, Nireh, it seems, Dahane Mile, when we say this, Keshehidlik Yisrael et ha'esh, Uba achar kach hagoy, Usfata kedera aleha, that we're talking about here where the Jew lights the fire and then afterwards the non-Jew places the pots upon it. That would be a problem. Aval im safata akum et ha'kederat techila, but if the non-Jew places the pot on the stove first, and then Yisrael hidlika esh, and then the Jew came and lit the fire. In that scenario, it works for everyone because the lighting of the fire is as if you're not only lighting the fire, but also placing it on the heat source. And so there we go. Another question comes into, which is how much cooking is done? Perhaps the Jew will do some of the cooking, or maybe the non-Jew will begin the cooking. How far of the cooking process can be done here? So it says here in source number 35, in Bishul goy kamachal ben dirusai, if the non-Jew cooked the food to the point of ma'achal ben dirusai, and that's a machloket Rashi, Rambam, whether that's a half or a third of the fully away cooked, the Gamron Yisrael, and the Jew completed the cooking process, Yesh Asur, that in itself is forbidden. Why? Because you might say that since it's a third or a half cooked, Bakoshi, if I was in a pressing situation, I could probably eat that. And therefore, the Jew completing the cooking process isn't that helpful. And so therefore, Maran says that's only permitted if it's Friday afternoon, close to Shabbat, or Erev Yom Tov, or Sheyesh Hefsed Me'ubeh b'davar, or there's a great financial loss. But the Ramah says, V'yesh matirin b'chol inyan, we permit that completely in all cases. And again, we see here where Maran is much more strict than the Ramah. In source 36, the Minchat Asher of Asher Weiss, who is a contemporary posek, who was people are reading a lot about him now because he writes a lot about coronavirus. So he's a lot in halachic literature. He talks about whether when you cut the shawarma on a rotisserie, and by cutting off the edges, that causes the inner parts to get heated up by the fire. Let's say that the person cutting the meat isn't Jewish. Is that considered cooking it? And near the Minchat Asher says that that's not a problem even for Sephardim. Okay, since the food is already cooking slowly, that's not really doing any more, and everyone is lenient. Thank God we can all eat our shawarma without much worry. Now, let's get into this question about non-Jewish servants or employees in a Jewish home. I get this question all the time, especially with nannies and things like that? Can they start to make, they picked up the kids from school, they're starting off with their homework. Can they make dinner before the parents get home so that dinner can be ready as soon as they're there? So here, we're going to see this machloket between the Rashba and the Ramban, okay? So we see here in source 37, he writes, Sheyesh Merabotai, and there are from my teachers, the Ramban, Nachmanides amongst them, which have suppressed the halachic prohibition, al bishulei ha'avadim ha'shvachot shalanu lahatir, where they permit servants or maidservants to make the food. And the reason they give for their opinion is that the prohibition of cooking is only due to the decree concerning chatnut, which is intermarriage, as Stephen was saying. And the decree of intermarriage and closeness applies only to someone who does something of his own will out of love for the Jew. But these individuals must do their work whether they desire or not. And there's no closeness of the heart in this type of case, nor is there a concern of chatnut, of intermarriage. Mikol makom, ein devreihem mechuvarin be'einenu. He says, nevertheless, even though the Ramban is my primary teacher, I do not think that their words are clear in my eyes. Ve'ein anu somchin al zeh, we should not rely on this. Ela shenohagim anu isu b'bishulehem afilu b'di'avad. We should be strict about their food, ve'afilu b'di'avad, even after the fact, one should not do so. And therefore, the Shulchan Aruch says, Yesh mi shematir b'shvachot shalanu. There are those who are lenient regarding our maidservants. The Yesh mi she'oser. And there are those who prohibit. So he brings the Ramban, and then he brings the Rashba, afilu b'di'avad, even after the fact. And when you have a situation where the Maran brings two opinions, a yesh and a yesh, those who say and those who say, we always go after the second opinion. So it seems to be the Sephardic approach will be strict, even b'di'avad. But the Rama says, u'b'di'avad yesh nismoch ad divrei matirim. After the fact, we should rely on the lenient position. And even ideally, we should say, that we should be lenient in a Jewish home. Why? Since the maidservants and the servants are cooking in the Jewish house, it's inconceivable, it's impossible that a Jew in the household wouldn't have gone in and put a chip on the fire or put a log on there. So clearly there must be a reason to rely on it. So this question is, can Sephardim rely on the Ramban, or can they rely on the Rama, where it seems to be that the Rashba and Maran Yosef Cairo are strict? And the Shach here brings 4 positions for how it could possibly be that we allow it. And he writes these down here. And he says, number 1, one must say that he, Rav Moshe Isserles, the Rama, refers to the same maidservants that the Mechaber dealt with, even though they did not exist in the Rama's locale. And he's talking about perhaps here that these maidservants were, they lived in the home of the Jew, and so therefore they had to keep all the laws of the Jew, and so therefore even Shabbat, and therefore we don't treat them as non-Jews. Alternatively, he means that one may rely on those that permit Bishul Akum in the Jew's house, and there's a position there that since the non-Jews are doing the food in the Jewish home, there isn't a concern of that. Again, 2 very much minority positions which aren't mainstream. Number 3, his primary consideration relies on the reasoning that one of the household members will certainly stir it a little. And that's true. Perhaps some of the younger members of the house, perhaps they're going to be involved in the cooking. And number 4, Perhaps these maidservants and servants of ours must do it whether they desire it or not. There's no closeness of the heart, and therefore there is no real concern of intermarriage. But how does he conclude? He says as follows, Mikol makom, nevertheless, ein divrehem mechuvarin be'einenu. These words are not correct in our eyes, it's not clear. Ve'ein anu somchin al zeh, and we should not rely on it. Who does that sound like? That sounds like the Rashba that we saw before. But he says, however, unlike the Rashba says you shouldn't rely on it even b'diavad, here the Shach says you could rely on these situations b'diavad, ipso facto. So based on what we've seen, it seems that the Shulchan Aruch holds there's no leniency for maidservants, whereas the Ramah is it's possible they may be permitted when cooking in the Jew's home. According to the Shach, it depends upon which of the four interpretations the Ramah followed. However, the practical halacha is that we only do this b'di'avad and not lechatchila for Ashkenazim. And as I said before, Sephardim, even b'di'avad, it seems to be a problem. You see that there in source number 40, he writes that b'di'avad, that after the fact, the Ashkenazim can rely on those positions. So here's our question, which I pinged you all before, which is, may Sephardim rely on the leniencies of the Ramah? Now, this is a huge question because everything that we've seen so far isn't just this is Sephardic practice. This is Sephardic practice as maintained, and the rule has been established by Rav Yosef Cairo. Whenever the rule is established by Rav Yosef Cairo, specifically, Rav Ovadia Yosef is strict. He always holds that his goal is to bring all Jews, especially all Sephardic Jews, to keep the practices of Maran Yosef Cairo. If that's the case, at first glance, there seems to be no attempt that we could say that Rav Ovadia Yosef should rely on the positions of the Ramah. I would say he has to follow the rules of Maran, and there's nothing to talk about. But he writes as follows, and this is very interesting. So how does he explain this? So Rav Ovadia, let's read in the second paragraph there, he says, he attempts to defend this custom by employing a safek sfeka, what's known as a double doubt, or literally doubt, using the issue of the servants. Since it's unclear whether we accept the opinions that allow non-Jewish servants to cook the food, and that could be true even of today's workers, it is uncertain whether we follow the Shulchan Aruch or Ramah for whether the Jew may participate in the actual cooking. We may be lenient due to the double uncertainty. Although regarding both points, Shulchan Aruch is strict, Rav Ovadia suggests that perhaps Rav Yosef Cairo himself would have been lenient in cases where both points are relevant together due to this double doubt. Now, I've been reading this and I've been reading it, And every time I reread it, I have the same problem. It doesn't sit well with me what Rav Ovadia Yosef is saying. The reason being not that I don't want him to be lenient, but he's going against his principles. His principles are whatever Rav Yosef Cairo says is the law. And Rav Yosef Cairo was very clear, this is wrong, this is wrong. And to say, well, perhaps there's a doubt in this scenario, and perhaps there's a doubt in this scenario, and so therefore we can be lenient according to the Ramah, doesn't really make sense to me. And he says here that, let's go all the way to the, in summary, he says, Besikum, he says, Gamas Sfaradim uvnei edot ha-mizrach, yesh lahem al ma yismachu. All Sephardim, they have what to rely on. To be guests and to eat in hotels, and kosher restaurants, to follow the local rabbinut restaurants, Even if the chefs and the workers are not Jewish. Kevan, why? That since the mashkiach lights the fire of the oven used for cooking and baking, and if it would go out, he'd relight it. And one who is stringent, tzavo alav bracha, may the blessing be upon his head. Rab Ben Zion Abba Shaul, in his Or LeTzion, another wonderful Sephardic Acharon, writes against Chacham Ovadia Yosef, and he says, Ein lanu lahatir le'echol. There is no permissor to allow eating for Jews to eat in restaurants which are run by non-Jews. And even if the Jew lights the fire, this is not enough if the non-Jews are placing the pots in the oven. And since Maran Yosef Karber was strict, how can we not follow him? And so therefore, here is our scenario. And here is our bottom line position. What do we say where we are right now? Well, we could employ a number of things. Number one, we could talk about what's actually being made. Perhaps it's not food which is fit for the king's table. And that's what we just talked about last week. Or when we said the king's table, it's not banquet foods. If I go to Island Crust, no offense, Island Crust, and I order a pizza and fries, it's not really something I'd expect at a banquet. Or if I just get some soup or a salad, it's not something which you'd get at a banquet. Secondly, if it's something which can be eaten raw, again, I have no problem with Bishul Akum. Thirdly, I can also use this permissor of saying, do you mind if I put my food in the oven, or do you mind if I put the steak on the fry pan? Those are ways that we can get around it to do so. Fourthly,
wait, hold on. I thought you said potatoes were a problem last week because potatoes are fit for a king's table.
I didn't mention potatoes. Where did you hear me say potatoes?
You said French fries. Aren't those potatoes?
Oh, come on. French fries are definitely not something which is
Well,
come on, Ita. I'm not even going to go there.
I'm asking the form of potatoes. That's why I brought that up.
No, Ita, I think you have to go, again, we can be as strict as we want and say that every food being made is fit for the king's table, especially if our current president would eat them. But I don't think that if I was to go to Buckingham Palace and I was invited to be to be a guest of the Queen's, that they're going to serve me French fries. I agree. Or even freedom fries.
But that's my whole point. I was asking about potatoes because I don't know if it matters what form they're served in, or if it does matter the form.
Yeah, I would go with the Aruch HaShulchan and say that anything which is potatoes is not an issue.
Okay.
Jonathan, nice comment there. Their fries are always there at the Burger King table. Yeah. I would say that we can use the Aruch HaShulchan's position of potatoes are not particularly fancy, rice is not particularly fancy. So I'm saying there's lots of areas. However, with all these okimtas, with all these limiting positions, there's still scenarios where it can be problematic. And there, I would say, in those limited cases where it's definitely Bishul Akum, we can do two things. Number one, we can place the food on the fire ourselves and ask, do you mind if I come into the kitchen and put the food on? I think sometimes if you explain it nicely and friendly, I think even our restaurants, I don't think they would have a problem with it because, a lot of us who frequent the restaurants, there's not that many clients. So I think they probably wouldn't mind it. Although today with COVID, you never know if they would be comfortable with that scenario. But the other thing is, as much as I think it's a little problematic what Chacham Ovadia Yosef is saying, there are plenty of people who are bigger rabbis than I am who would say there's nothing wrong with following Chacham Ovadia Yosef. We don't all have to be strict and follow Rav Zion Abba Shaul. So again, I think, everyone should go with good conscience and do as they're following, but just something to be aware of. I'm not saying it's something where suddenly we have to say, you know what, I've been doing the wrong thing all this time. It's just perhaps there's something to think about. So now to Sharon's question about microwaving food. Is that the same thing? Does the microwave need to be turned on by a Jew, or can the non-Jew microwave the food? So let's have a look here, and perhaps the answer can be derived from following the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah concerning salting, smoking, and soaking done by a non-Jew, where they state that these methods of preparing food are still not subject to Bishul Akum. And it says as follows: Dag shemacho avet kochavim, fish that was salted by a non-Jew, uperot she'ashnan ad she'chshiran la'achila, or fruit that was smoked to the point that it was edible, harei elu mutarin, the whole these are permitted. The miluach eno karoteach, because there are so salting is not considered like boiling with respect to this decree. And smoking is not considered like cooking, and pickling is not like cooking, as they only forbade cooking by fire. And so therefore one could say that it's permissible. Although one could argue from here that Bishul Akum should only apply to fire and not to cooking in a microwave, Rav Shmuel Vosner writes that anything that is considered a normal matter of cooking should be included in this restriction, and he holds that cooking in a microwave, which is very common today, is a problem of Bishul Akum. And he says it there in source 44. In the answer to this matter, I will say that it is obvious that this is forbidden due to Bishul Akum, since both the reasons for the decree of intermarriage or that perhaps you will feed him non-kosher food are relevant to a microwave. Anything that is cooked and prepared for a meal in a manner that is normal in our times, and people eat this food as being cooked as part of the decree that Chazal enacted. But others, such as Rav Asher Weiss, claim that this matter is not so simple, and he does permit a non-Jewish helper to cook for an elderly person who is ill, in cases of need, in conjunction with opinion that any workers are not subject to Bishul Akum. Now, it's important to note here that this case where Rav Asher Weiss permits it, it's dealing with a choleh, with a sick person or an elderly person, and therefore it's not the same as a regular healthy person. So I'm not surprised, Sharon, that when you go to a restaurant, if they're microwaving something, that it has to be done by a Jew. And the Mincha Asher says here, in our times, cooking in the microwave is not a primary manner of cooking, and the quality of such cooking is not as high as the quality of cooking by fire. And that is that which Shevet Talei Rav Vosner writes, that the concern of intermarriage applies. He says he's astonished. Who said that those concerns apply to smoked food? And even so, they did not apply the decree. He says one should be lenient in the case of need, that a Gentile may cook in a microwave in conjunction with the opinion of the Ramah. So I would say here is a reason to be lenient if someone is sick. I don't think it's something to be using for a situation for all situations. And the Sefer Kashrut writes, food that was already cooked by a Jew, even if one cannot eat it cold but only hot, merely heating it up by a Gentile does not create a prohibition of Bishul Akum. So here again, and what's the likelihood of that scenario? Again, that's most likely where you have the non-Jews helping in the home. It's certainly not going to be in the restaurant. In fact, I don't think the restaurant would last very long if that was scenario. Interesting point of view here is, let's say that the utensils are cooked by the Jews, and I have Bishul Akum, it took place. Do the pots and pans, do they need to be kashered or not? The Rashba writes that they do need to be kashered, whereas the Rosh says they do not. However, since it's the Sephardim who are being strict and are saying that they need to be kashered, the Sephardim are also lenient with regard to kashering, and they would hold that regarding the kashering, you would only need to do hagalah, would only need to do boiling water. One would not require libun, what would not require a blowtorch, wouldn't have to put straight down fire on it. So on the one hand, Sephardim are strict, they would require kashering, but on the other hand, the kashering process is a lot easier. I always say when it comes to Sephardim having accidents in the kitchen, it's a lot easier to fix those problems because most of them can be fixed with hagalah, with boiling water, whereas with Ashkenazim, when there's an actual kashrut accident, it actually requires, in many cases, libun of direct fire, and so therefore, you know, sometimes it's a win to be Sephardic because the solution is not as problematic. And so now I think we've concluded Bishul Akum. We've explained where and when and how it applies. We've seen some situations where we can limit the scope. We've seen some situations where perhaps it's a forced read of the Ramah, justifying the position, and certainly a forced read of Hacham Ovadia Yosef to say that Rav Yosef Cairo would be lenient in combining the two factors. However, you know, puk chazeh, go out and see what people are doing, and I think we have that to rely on. Let's open it up for questions.